something that many of you have brought up on this program over the last couple of years, and that is migration levels, immigrants coming in. And Sustainable Population Australia have put out a release today saying it's time to stabilise our population, saying many of us are frustrated at the impact of rapid population growth on day-to-day living and frustrated their voices not being heard by political leaders. Let's have a chat with Leith Van Onselen, Chief Economist and co-founder of Macro Business, who's on the line. Leith, good morning.
G'day, Matthew. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. So this wouldn't come as a surprise to anyone hearing this, that a lot of people think migration has been too high in recent years and it needs to come to a slow to a trickle at best.
Yeah, look, certainly I think that's the case. So Australia's population, just to put it into perspective, since the turn of the century, so since 2000, we've grown the population by about 8.5 million people. Now, that's an extraordinary amount of growth in a short period of time. And the way that's come about is because the federal government from the mid-2000s massively increased our migration intake. So for basically in the 60 years post-World War II, we averaged about 90,000 net overseas migration a year. And in the 20 years leading up to the pandemic, that surged to 220,000 a year. Wow. And then obviously recovering from the pandemic, we've had 550,000 last year, and the long-run projections from the Intergeneration Report are that we're going to have 235,000 net overseas migration indefinitely. And what that's projected to do is to increase Australia's population to 40.5 million people in just 39 years by 2062-63 from currently 27.5 million. So that just to put those numbers into perspective, that's a 13 million increase in the next 39 years. And that's the equivalent of adding another Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane to Australia's population in just 39 years. Now, that's an enormous amount of people. And what it means is that basically, if you live in a major city, future residents are going to have to live in high-rises. Yeah. Because, I'm from Melbourne, so obviously it's a lot worse down here, but we were 3.5 million people at the turn of the century.
Rapidly?
Look, unfortunately, the Intergeneration Report's very biased. It's done by the Australian Treasury, and the way it works at the moment is the federal government collects about 80% of the nation's tax revenues, and the states and local governments collect about 20%. So what it means is the federal government gets most of the benefits from immigration through increased personal taxes and company taxes, but the costs of immigration are borne by the state and local governments and residents at large. And as a result, the federal government sees big migration as just a win because it just bolsters the federal budget without them having to pay the extra costs associated with migration. And as a result, the Intergeneration Report is just basically one big propaganda report arguing for a larger population on budgetary grounds, effectively.
Right. Okay.
And so, yeah, look, it can pretty much be ignored. It's a biased document. It doesn't weigh up the cost to residents at large from this much larger population.
All right. So apart from high-rise living, the argument has always been we've got so much space in this country. We can fill it with people and you wouldn't miss a beat. But that's not really how it works, of course, because everyone goes to the major cities, particularly.
That's right. And also we have a very fragile ecosystem. So where is the water going to come from? We already have a situation where we don't have enough water supplies to supply the existing population over the long term. And as a result, we're building desalination plants everywhere. And desalination plants have to be built on the coast. Yeah. And then they have to be piped inland and against gravity. So they're very, very expensive to build. They're also environmentally destructive. And the whole notion that we can just spread this huge increase in population inland is just a pipe dream because it just isn't the water supplies to do it. Yeah. And as a result, we know that migrants tend to come to Sydney and Melbourne, Brisbane mostly, and then we get spillovers into Adelaide and other places. And as a result, that's why we're looking at these population projections for places like Melbourne: 3.5 million at the turn of the century, in year 2000, to 9 million people by 2056, and Sydney roughly doubling in the same period. Yeah. So the whole notion, it's great in theory. Yes, we should spread them out, but the reality is, and under the current projections, Sydney and Melbourne are going to become mega cities, and Sydney's and Melbourne's populations by, say, 2070 are going to be larger. Each city is going to be larger than the entire Australian population was in 1950.
Goodness me.
Which is just enormous.
Yeah. the argument has been, as our existing population ages, we need to bring in younger people to help look after the aged. And but that doesn't end, does it? Because you bring in people today, eventually they're going to be aged. So then the argument will be, well, you bring more people in to help look after them. And it's a sort of a vicious, never-ending circle.
Yeah, look, it's the ultimate pyramid scheme.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons why Australia has an aging population now is because of the post-war migration boom and obviously the baby boomer generation. So families had a lot of births in 1950, 1960, and also we had a lot of migration back then. And guess what? Those people have now gotten old, and as a result, we've got an aging problem now. So the solution always is, let's bring in migrants because they're a little bit younger temporarily, and that de-ages the population. Yeah. But all you have to do is fast forward 40 years' time, and all the current migration boom that we're bringing in now are going to be old. And then we're going to face exactly the same problems, except we're going to have a much bigger population to deal with it. And I'll just add one other thing, Matthew. Another reason why this is disastrous policy for Australia is because Australia is a massive, energy exporter, a resource exporter. We have huge amounts of resources wealth. We have pretty much everything the world needs except for oil. We have, oodles of coal, iron ore, uranium, nickel, lithium, all these sorts of things. And the worst thing you can do is to basically grow the population aggressively, because all you end up doing is diluting your mineral wealth amongst more people. So you actually become poorer per person. And that's effectively the Australian economic model. We don't tax resources properly, so we don't get enough benefit from it. And then we also increase our population aggressively through immigration so that the resources are worth less per person, which actually makes you poorer in the long run.
Yeah. Not to mention the fact, and it's not the quarter-acre block, it's, as you've said repeatedly, high-rise towers that are going to have to be built to house all these people. That doesn't solve the housing problem at all.
No, it's also a massive dilution in your standard of living. So whereas past generations could afford a house with a backyard on a single income, we're facing a future whereby, especially if you live in Sydney, Melbourne, and this is a debate that's playing out in these cities right now, where the governments want to basically have, deregulate planning so you can have 20-storey tower blocks in existing suburbs everywhere.
Yeah.
And what it basically means is the future residents are going to be paying more to live in high-rise shoeboxes, whereas previous generations got to live in a detached house in a backyard. And I'd argue that is a massive dilution of Australia's quality of life. Yeah. And this is the fundamental driver to that is excessive levels of immigration, because, again, if you're going to grow Melbourne from 3.5 million people turn of the century to 9 million people, you're going to have people living in high-rise. That's the reality of it.
Yeah.
There's no other way around it.
Either major party look like they're taking interest in this, Leith?
Look, the coalition to a degree is not nearly enough, but they have pledged to lower the permanent migrant intake to 140,000 for a couple of years, from currently 185,000. That's not including humanitarians. But certainly, they do want to lower net overseas migration more than Labor does, and I think that's a good thing. But I think they need to go harder. Like, really, Australia's net overseas migration should not exceed 120,000 a year. It was we before 2005. We averaged in the previous 60 years after the Second World War, we averaged about 90,000. I think 120,000 is the right amount. That's a sustainable amount. We should just make it very high skilled.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So that we're really only importing people with genuine skills that we genuinely need, rather than just this open flather approach that we've been running.
Is there room for the argument that as a compassionate, wealthy country, we should do more to help the world's needy in that regard? I mean, if I wanted to play devil's advocate, I'd certainly put that argument to you. Is there room for that?
Well, yeah. I mean, we already do have a very high humanitarian intake per capita. So our humanitarian intake's 20,000 a year, which is quite substantial, especially given our population size.
Yeah.
But certainly we already do a lot of that stuff, but unfortunately, Australia's current migration system is geared around poaching so-called skilled workers from less developed countries who need those workers. Right? They end up coming to Australia, then they don't end up using those skills anyway, and they end up driving Ubers. And doing those sorts of things.
Yeah.
And so I argue, is that actually a benefit to the source country?
Yeah.
You're effectively stripping them of their workers. bring them to Australia, and then they don't end up working in those areas anyway.
Yeah. It's
So
interesting.
it's actually worse.
Yeah, you're right. And I had an Uber driver the other day who was telling me in India he was a skilled heavy vehicle diesel mechanic, and he's got a contract here to do that as part of his coming to Australia. And he is doing that, although the contract is coming to an end and the company looking to re-employ him and others, but they've got to stay with the company for X amount of time. I think it's 3 years or so as part of their working visa. And in the meantime, he's driving Ubers because there was some sort of issue with the visa and he's afraid that might fall over. So he's got this job middle of the night driving Ubers, and away he was going. But yeah, it's interesting. We do bring in people with skills and then don't employ them in the areas they're good at. And you're right, they do end up driving Ubers.
Yeah, and absolutely. So a classic example, that's engineering. So 60% of engineers in Australia are foreign-born, right? So we import a lot of engineering. But half of the people with engineering degrees in Australia are not working in engineering. They're either unemployed or underemployed in low-skilled jobs. And that is just, indicative of Australia's migration system.
Yeah.
We bring in oodles of people, and then most of them end up working in lower skilled jobs.
Yep.
And then that creates a housing crisis because we're growing the population so much faster than we can build houses. And most of them don't work in construction trades. And then you end up with this, you end up with a rental crisis and a housing crisis. Yeah. And then you end up with skill shortages because the people you brought in to solve those skill shortages end up not solving the shortage because they're not working in the areas. And the thing about this whole skills shortage argument, it's complete furphy. So, for example, we could bring in 500,000 construction workers. We can import them to try and solve the shortage of construction labour. And even if we could theoretically do that, those people would need houses themselves.
Yes, of course.
But then you create shortages in other areas because that 500,000 people you bring in, their kids need teachers.
Yep.
They need hospital workers because it'll increase demand on healthcare. It'll increase demand on every other area of the economy, which then means you'll have shortages in those areas. So then the solution is to import people in those areas. And if you keep going around this circle, you end up back with shortages in construction again. Because you just play whack-a-mole in all these areas. Yeah,
that's right. Exactly.
And then every time you whack that mole, you then create a shortage in another area because you've increased demand in those areas.
Crazy. Leith, great discussion. Thank you for your time this morning.
Introducing Officeworks for Business.